The World Food Programme is warning that more than 300 million people face critical levels of hunger next year. The United Nations body says that's double the number compared to 2019. So what's behind this worsening crisis that's putting so many people in danger? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Adrian Finighan. The World Food Programme is warning that around 318 million people across the world face crisis levels of hunger or even starvation next year. The United Nations body describes the figures as staggering, saying they're more than double the number recorded 6 years ago. Cuts in aid funding by richer nations are partly behind the rise, along with other factors, including conflict and climate change. The crisis also comes as spending on weapons is surging. The World Food Programme says that just 1% of what's been spent on military budgets during the past decade could end world hunger by 2030. So why are so many people now in danger, and which countries are worst affected? Why is the situation worsening, and what might change it? We'll hear from our guests shortly, but first a report from Alexandra Bauer.
A stark warning from the UN. A global hunger crisis is soaring and humanitarian funding collapsing. The World Food Programme has just released its outlook for 2026 and says cuts to its funding mean it will struggle to feed even a third of those in need. After more than 2 years of war, famine conditions were confirmed in the city of Al-Fasher in Sudan and 20 other areas in Darfur and Kordofan. More than half of the population is facing food shortages.
1 meal a day is not enough. Sometimes kind, charitable people bring lamb or beef, but it's still not enough for our basic needs.
In Gaza City, a famine was declared in August after the Israeli military imposed a months-long total blockade on the Strip. Despite a ceasefire, Israel continues to restrict food and aid supplies, and the hunger crisis remains dire.
The famine lasted 4 months with no food at all for 2 months. I brought home animal feed and my wife grounded it and cooked it into bowls just to give my children something to eat.
The UN's identified 14 other hunger hotspots. Haiti, Mali, South Sudan, and Yemen are among those at imminent risk of catastrophic hunger. Afghanistan, Democratic Republic of Congo, Myanmar, Somalia, and Syria are all classified as very high concern.
We've seen the highest surge in child malnutrition ever recorded in the country, and the lives of 3 million children are in peril. Mothers who may walk 4 to 5 hours to bring their child to the clinic in their arms, walking across mountainous terrain. They arrive at the clinic and they're told, "I'm sorry, there's been aid cuts. We cannot feed your child."
Conflicts, economic instability, and extreme weather are driving the crisis. And despite the growing urgency, severe funding shortfalls are crippling emergency responses. The U.S. was the largest single donor of foreign aid, but the Trump administration has sharply reduced funding. Other countries have also announced major cuts. The UN says millions of lives depend on restarting that funding now. Its emergency food programs are at a breaking point, and the world is on the brink of what it calls an entirely preventable hunger catastrophe. Alexandra Bauer, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
Let's bring in our guests. Jean-Martin Bauer is Director of Food Security and Nutrition Analysis Service at the United Nations World Food Programme. He joins us from Rome. Shahin Ashraf is Head of Global Advocacy at Islamic Relief Worldwide. She joins us from Birmingham in the United Kingdom. And joining us from Kinshasa is Manenji Mangundum, who's Oxfam's country director in the Democratic Republic of Congo. A warm welcome to you all. Jean-Martin, let's start with you. Before we talk about this shortfall of funding and what's behind it, I want to look at the root causes of the problem. Why are so many people in the world right now food insecure? How much of this is entirely man-made in places like Gaza and in Sudan, for example, due to war and displacement? How much of it is down to the fact that the world's climate is changing and crops are failing more regularly?
The situation, Adrian, is basically man-made. 2/3 of the 318 million people we've highlighted in our report live in situations of fragility and conflict. For the first time this century, we have two concurrent famines, you mentioned them in your piece, taking place in Gaza and in parts of Sudan. This is unprecedented and is the result of very limited access to the population by humanitarian agencies, by the impact of violence on communities and on food systems. Climatic factors are, of course, also at play, and we had a very good example of that with the hurricane in the Caribbean, Hurricane Melissa, affecting many Caribbean islands, and also the typhoon in the Philippines. But the conflicts the world is experiencing is the number one factor, and quite often climatic factors contribute and aggravate the situation, but economic factors are also there. Many countries are experiencing inflation. Food inflation is quite high in many places, and that makes a healthy meal unaffordable to too many people in those contexts that you've mentioned.
Shahin, as the executive director of UNICEF said earlier this year, in a world of plenty, there is no excuse for children to go hungry or to die of malnutrition. Many people watching this program or listening to the podcast version of it will think, how, in this day and age, can nearly 300 million people, more than 300 million people predicted next year, be facing hunger and food insecurity?
So we're living in a paradox, and there's never been more food in the world. And yet, as you've reported, the more people are going hungry. And that's not because of scarcity, but because, as you mentioned in your story before, this is because of climate change, this is because of conflict, and it's also because of deepening inequalities. They're cutting people off from the food and the rights they need to survive. And at the same time, what you're finding is richer nations have stepped back from their promises that they made around the sustainable development goals and to climate financing as well. And so humanitarian law, for example, in your report, you mentioned Gaza as well, that also being violated with impunity. So the result is a world that's less safe, less equal, and less stable. So when aid is cut, as was mentioned by the previous speaker, you've got the conflict amplification. So food insecurity actually worsens instability. So when people go hungry, there's social tensions rise, and conflicts are more likely to flare or intensify, like your report mentioned in Sudan, for example. Then as a result of that, you've got the rising hunger and the malnutrition, as your report mentioned, Gaza and Sudan. And so millions of people can fall back into this acute food insecurity space. So when you have all that and conflict-affected countries where it's all hunger-related, aid cuts exacerbate this. And as a result of that, you'll find migration and displacement. So that reduced aid drives more people to flee conflict zones or climate disasters, and increasing the pressure on neighboring countries like in the Sudan border regions, like in Chad, in the context of Sudan.
Manenji, we hear a lot about the situation in places like Gaza and in Sudan. Tell us about what's happening there in the Democratic Republic of Congo as far as food insecurity is concerned, what's causing it there, and in the wider region beyond the DRC.
Thanks very much. If you look for the case of DRC, conflict remains the main driver of humanitarian crisis, because it's like, if you look around the country, it's affected by fighting nearly everywhere. And this is making it not feasible for people to access their land, to do their day-to-day activities, and improve food production. And also, if you look the case of DRC again, because of the conflict, most of the regions that are producing food, they are not able actually to do good trade from one area to the other. For example, right now, if you look at east of DRC, where majority of the people in the West, which is in Kinshasa, were depending on meat, on food, on even vegetables from the East. Now they can't get it because all the airports are closed. Then the second aspect, again, is the climate change. The climate change from the community's perspective, is saying it's difficult for them to do planning like before, where they know the wet season, how it is spread across the country. Now it takes, it's like they don't know when to start up planting their crops and so forth. And then heavy rains that cause flooding that also affects their crops. And in some parts, like in the west around Kasai region, when there are droughts, they are not able to harvest good as they used to do. So these collectively are contributing to food insecure. And by the way, we are seeing that in DRC, for example, right now, we have almost 28 million people who are food insecure, and they need humanitarian assistance. At the same time, humanitarian funding is cut. I think we all understand that when USAID cuts the humanitarian fund in DRC, they were funding almost 70% of the total humanitarian fund in DRC. And up to now, this year, we're almost end of the year, but we're only 40% of the total funding, which is 70% less than the average since 2000, when we started to monitor the funding, when we started using the funding tracking system. So people, they continue to go hungry, as well as I think reprioritization, which is not prioritizing the agriculture and more food production in the country.
Okay. Jean-Martin, earlier in the year, the UN Secretary General said that this isn't just a failure of systems and funding, it's a failure of humanity. The WFP anticipates being able to feed around 110 million people next year, leaving much of the global population in need of food help without its assistance. It estimates that its operational requirement will stand at $13 billion next year, most of that going to crisis response and other expenses, including resilience building and addressing root causes, which we addressed a few moments ago. What happens if it doesn't get that money?
If we don't get the funding, this means that we will be forced to take from the hungry to feed the starving. It's a very difficult process of prioritization. We estimate that with these funding cuts, many more people are shifting into emergency levels of hunger. We use a scale in the humanitarian space, a 5-point scale to rate hunger, phase 1 being normal, phase 2 being a crisis, 3 being an emergency, 3 being a crisis, 4 being an emergency, and 5 being a catastrophe. People will be shifting from 3 to 4, from crisis to emergency. We estimate that 14 million people will be tipping into that level, and that really moves the needle in terms of need. People who are the most affected are going to be the women, the children, and people in a situation of displacement. The displaced people, especially in Sudan and as we saw in Gaza, are especially vulnerable to aid cuts, especially vulnerable to food insecurity. We need to be careful. Cuts of this magnitude have an effect on individuals, and you have portrayed that well in the piece that you showed earlier on. But there's also an impact on communities, there's an impact on social cohesion, and there's an impact at the level of stability of nations, because unresolved hunger leads to migration, unresolved hunger leads to instability. We need to watch out.
Shahin, I want to pick up on something that you were saying in your answer a few moments ago and link it to something that the UN Secretary General said earlier in the year. Hunger in the 21st century is indefensible, he said. We cannot respond to empty stomachs with empty hands and turned backs. To what extent do most of us who do have enough to eat simply don't care enough to make our governments do something about it? How much of this crisis is the fault of people like you and I, and that we're not pressuring our governments enough to sort it out?
Well, I mean, we are pressuring our governments, many of us. I mean, one of the things I want to say is to stress is that Islamic Relief Worldwide and the World Food Programme actually work together in places like Gaza and Sudan and Yemen and some of the hardest and the most dangerous humanitarian environments in the world. And what we're seeing time and time again is that when funding is there, aid works. So families get food, children get nutrition, support, and entire communities are able to survive conflict, drought, and displacement. So the tragedy is that these life-saving programs are being cut just when the need is at its height. So why is it happening? So I guess the concise analysis around that would be, we've already spoken about conflict, climate change, and many of us have said that, wars destroy food and markets, droughts and floods wipe out harvests, and the poorest suffer first. It's a deadly cycle, and millions pay the price. Not nature, not chance, but as you said, human decisions. So when governments cut aid, it's not just about numbers on a page. It's families going hungry. It's about children being malnourished and the life-saving programs forced to close. And so cuts don't save money, they cost lives. So when you've mentioned, for example, I can talk about the UK government. The UK government itself has slashed its aid budget from 0.5% to 0.3%. So it's raising its defense budget to historical levels, but it's doing so by slashing aid. So not just a budget move, it's a political choice about how we engage around the world. So by cutting that 0.5% of our national income to 3.3%, the government is trading global stability and development for military hardware. And so what we do is when that happens, we actually risk undermining our soft power and our humanitarian leadership just at the moment when the world needs us most. And what we see and the implications of that are strategic trade-offs. The UK is explicitly choosing to trade off development, soft power, to invest in other things like military aid. And so that impacts vulnerable countries, and that aid that cuts off some of the world's poorest and most fragile states, especially development programs, climate support or humanitarian response, we argue that it undermines the UK's moral and diplomatic influence. And then that creates long-term security risks. So we are doing as much as we can in terms of pushing our governments to be able to, the public debate on the pushback and the backlash from NGOs, former officials and politicians who say diplomacy, development and defense should all be funded and not pitched against each other.
Manenji, going back to what you were saying a few moments ago about the situation in the DRC, where 70% of humanitarian aid from US aid was cut at the peak of the crisis in the east of the country. Conflict is, as we've established, a major driver of food insecurity. But to a certain extent, that's beyond the control of aid organizations and the international community, even if they wanted to help, isn't it?
Yeah, what I want to say is, millions of lives are hanging in the balance. As a result, we as NGOs, UN in the country, though we are doing humanitarian, responding to humanitarian crisis, but we are also engaging at global level, including in countries, talking to the ambassador and so forth, telling the stories of what we are seeing, people suffering there. So we are also putting across advocacy messages where we are pushing the government to ensure that they engage all people that are involved, all parties that are involved in the conflict, to come to an arrangement and to bring peace to the country. That's one of the push. I think you have seen as well recently, there was a donor conference in Paris, where collectively, as humanitarian actors in DRC, we put across all key messages that involves allowing, peace to prevail, allowing, humanitarian aid to flow into the country, humanitarian access and all corridors to be opened up so that people have access to humanitarian assistance. Because when we move around the areas where we are doing the response, we are seeing a huge impact. For example, the cuts that had happened, it has contributed to us to reprioritize. And through reprioritization, more people were left out and more children and women are going to suffer. Especially children are going to continue suffering from malnutrition and die. On top of that, we have realized again, it's not only conflict, but disease outbreaks like diarrhea, cholera, mpox, and lately the Ebola, that outbreak that we experienced again. So these are the things that we are pushing across all donor countries, all diplomats that is possible at our disposal, including engaging with the European Community to say, how best can you support this country to move forward? How do we put in place measures that help the communities to have peace and be able to do their day-to-day livelihood activities?
Jean-Martin, two questions. One of them, just a quick answer, please, this first one. I wonder to what extent hunger and malnutrition are spreading faster than the world can respond. Is there enough food available to feed every one of us on the planet wherever we are?
Adrian, that's an emphatic yes. There's plenty of food for everyone in the world. It's just not in the right places. It's not reaching the most vulnerable.
Okay, so what's it going to take to fix the problem? As we said at the beginning of the program, global military spending has risen to $2.7 trillion. That was in 2024, an increase of 9.4% in real terms from 2023. And yet your organization, the World Food Programme, says that ending hunger by 2030 would cost $93 billion a year. That's less than 1% of what's been spent on military budgets over the past decade. Do you think that the public understands the math here, that fixing hunger would take a fraction of the tax dollars that they are contributing to military spending every year?
So, Adrian, I'm not sure the penny's dropped with global public opinion, and I'm grateful to be here with you today and with the others to raise awareness about what's going on with global hunger. We at the World Food Programme realize that this problem is not going away. The money that used to come in will not come back immediately. This is going to be a slow burn. So we need to adapt. What we're trying to do is be as effective as possible with the limited resources we have. We're trying to innovate, make sure we squeeze as much benefit out of every remaining $8 that's out there. But as you alluded to in your question, Adrian, the solution to this problem, it's political solutions. We need to end these wars. We need to find diplomatic solutions that allow access to the populations that are suffering from insufficient food intake and that might be starving right now. In the meantime, we do need to fund these humanitarian programs to avert the consequences that I mentioned earlier on.
Shahin, you mentioned Gaza in a previous answer. What's the situation there now? Has it improved at all since the ceasefire? And if funding cannot be relied upon in the future, what can be done to make communities more resilient to food security shocks?
So the truth is, there's no real, single silver bullet, but there is a roadmap. We need sustained, well-funded humanitarian aid programs to meet the immediate needs, as the previous speaker said. That needs to be paired with long-term investment in local agricultural, nutrition, water, and healthcare. And addressing conflict and inequality is crucial. Because you can't feed people if war destroys their farms or destroys their markets. And tackling climate change through funding, adaptation, and support for vulnerable communities ensures people aren't repeatedly pushed into crisis. So I would say with the right political will and the resources, hunger is solvable. It's a choice and it's not a fate. And for us, I think when you look at the question that was previously posed, we have enough food to feed the world 1.5 times over. Yet, the answer to your question is who eats is determined by power, it's determined by access, it's determined by borders, and it's determined by wealth. The gap between those who produce food and those who profit from food has never been wider. So this is the global picture of inequality that we're seeing worldwide. So people are not starving because crops have failed. They're starving because systems have failed. So hunger today is a symptom of inequality and not of insufficient food. So for us, I think there is no single bullet, but there should be, and there is a roadmap that needs to be well-sustained, well-funded humanitarian aid. So actually that, we fulfill the broken promises that we have as an international community when we're far off track from zero hunger. Hunger is arising in regions where SDG commitments should have been delivered on, we should have delivered through major progress by now. So what we need to do, I think, is to understand that not only in Gaza, but around the world, where international, for example, law is ignored, hunger becomes a weapon and civilians pay the price. So for me, I think for us as an organization, we're saying that it's the inequality gap, which is not a glitch in the system. It is the system. And unless global economic rules change, we will keep fighting fires instead of preventing them.
Manenji, I just want to read you a quote from the UN Deputy Secretary General Amina Mohammed. She said that the poorest pay the ultimate price. When the elephants fight, it's the grass that suffers. She said, quoting the African proverb that's often used to convey the idea when two powerful nations or organizations or individuals engage in conflict, it's the weak or innocent who bear the brunt of the suffering. I mean, she's right, isn't she? It's always the poorest and the most vulnerable people, like the people in the DRC, who suffer.
I totally agree with you. What we are seeing on the ground is that the poorest women and children are the people that are suffering. Because the rich and the elite, they're enjoying. For example, if I give an example, is that if we look in the East, that's where the war is. And then if you look at the elite and those rich people, they're in Kinshasa and they're peaceful. And it's normal. It's daily living as usual. They have access to resources, which is not going back to the communities. I think recently we've been talking about how do we bring peace? Because when there's peace, there's development. I was really surprised. It's one of the conversations that was done when President Trump said, we need development. We don't need humanitarian assistance. But I say, we need peace first and foremost, so that people have access to land, people have access to markets, people can do cross-border trading without any challenges. But if we don't have peace, we can't do these things. If we don't have peace, there's poor people, they can't access their land, no matter what happens. And it's really challenging and very so sad that when we talk to the communities in the East, they say they just want to live their normal life in their own village, where they feel the challenges that they are facing at Kinshasa level is not the same challenge they are facing. They want to access their land. They want their kids to go to school. They want their kids to access health care and be able to harvest their plants.
Manenji, I'm sorry to cut you short, but we're rapidly running out of time. Jean-Martin, we've got about a minute and a half left. I mean, here we are, global platform, Al Jazeera. You're broadcasting to the entire world here. What is the WFP's message to world leaders about their moral obligation to end this scandal? And it is a scandal that is global food insecurity.
So I would tell global leaders that you have a moral obligation to respond to two concurrent famines and to a rise in acute food insecurity worldwide, but also a practical one. A practical obligation because an unaddressed food crisis will have consequences beyond the countries in which it takes place. These things tend to expand, unchecked. Food insecurity leads to migration, threatens international stability. So let's take this seriously.
And there, we must end it. Many thanks indeed for being with us. Jean-Martin Bauer, Shahin, Ashraf, and Manenji Mangundum. And thank you for watching. You can see the program again at any time by going to the website. That's at aljazeera.com. For further discussion, join us at our Facebook page at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And of course, you can always join the conversation on X. Our handle there at AJ Inside Story. From me, Adrian Finighan, and the whole team here, thanks for watching. We'll see you again. Bye for now.